Kyle Harper stood in front of the massive doors and felt his stomach sink. The grand archive stretched above him like a cathedral made of crystal and light, but thick metal bars blocked the entrance. A holographic seal floated in the air, pulsing with symbols he couldn't read. "I don't understand," Kyle said to the creature beside him. "I was assigned to work here as a cultural liaison. How can I do my job if the library is closed?" The Valkyrie archivist clicked her mandibles together in what Kyle had learned was their version of a patient sigh. Her name was Thresh, and her insectoid body gleamed like polished copper under the station's lights. "The main archives are not closed, Lieutenant Harper. They are protected. Protected from what?" "From those who are not ready," Thresh explained. Her compound eyes reflected his confused expression 100 times over. "Your species has only been traveling through space for 200 years. The Galactic Preservation Council has determined that humanity, along with 47 other developing species, requires more time before accessing unrestricted knowledge." Kyle felt heat rise in his chest. "You're saying humans aren't mature enough to read books?" "Not books, Lieutenant. Ideas, concepts, stories from species who have walked very different paths. The Council believes that premature exposure to certain philosophies could be harmful to developing civilizations." Thresh gestured to a smaller doorway to the left. "You have access to the educational wing. There are many approved materials suitable for younger species." The way she said younger species made Kyle's jaw tighten. He'd been in the galactic community for only 3 months, but he'd already grown tired of being treated like a child. Humans had built cities, created art, fought wars, made peace, and reached for the stars. They'd done it all without anyone's permission. And now some ancient aliens wanted to decide what stories he was allowed to read. "How long until we're ready?" Kyle asked. Thresh tilted her head. "The Tarn were granted full access after 52,000 years. The Kelsh after 48,000. The Council will evaluate humanity's progress periodically." 50,000 years? Kyle couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. "You expect us to wait 50,000 years to read the books in there?" "The Council is very thorough, Lieutenant. Now shall I show you to your workspace?" Kyle followed Thresh through the winding corridors of the Nexus station, barely paying attention to her explanations about filing systems and cultural database management. His mind kept returning to those sealed doors. What kind of knowledge could possibly be so dangerous that it needed to be locked away? What stories were hidden behind those bars? That evening, Kyle couldn't sleep. His quarters were comfortable enough. A small room with a window overlooking the swirling colors of the nebula beyond. He'd requested real books from Earth, and they'd arrived in a small crate the week before. He picked up a worn paperback copy of the Odyssey and ran his fingers over the cover. This story was almost 3,000 years old, and humans still read it. Still found meaning in it. Would the Council consider Homer dangerous? Would they lock away Shakespeare, Mark Twain, Maya Angelou? The thought made him angry. The next day, Kyle returned to the archives early. He told himself he just wanted to examine the seal more closely, to understand the mechanism. But really, he wanted to see those doors again, to remind himself what he was being denied. That's when he heard the scratching sound. Kyle froze, listening. It came from the sealed entrance, a soft scraping like metal on metal. He crept closer and peered around a massive pillar. 3 small figures huddled near the door. One was clearly Tarn, a reptilian child barely 3 feet tall with scales that shimmered green and gold. Another was Kelsh, her amphibious skin slick and blue in the dim light. The third was harder to identify, a crystalline being that refracted light into rainbow patterns across the floor. The Tarn child was trying to pick the lock with what looked like a bent piece of wire. "That's not going to work," Kyle said quietly. All 3 children jumped. The Kelsh girl made a sound like a frightened chirp. The crystalline being's internal lights flashed rapidly in what Kyle guessed was alarm. "Please don't tell the Guardians," the Tarn child said quickly. His voice was high and nervous. "We weren't doing anything wrong. We were just looking." Kyle should have reported them. He should have called station security and let them handle it. Instead, he found himself walking closer. "What were you looking for?" The 3 children exchanged glances. Finally, the Tarn spoke again. "Stories. The old ones say the Forbidden Section has the best stories in the galaxy. Adventures and battles and quests. Real exciting stuff, not the boring lessons they make us read in school. My name is Zix," the Tarn continued. "This is Nira and Prox. We just wanted to see one story. Just one. But we can't get past the lock." Kyle looked at the sealed doors, then back at the children. They reminded him of himself at that age, curious and frustrated by arbitrary rules. He thought about the books in his quarters, stories that had inspired generations of humans to dream bigger and reach further. "The lock is quantum encrypted," Kyle said. "You'd need clearance from at least 3 council members to open it." Zix's shoulders slumped. "So we can never get in?" "I didn't say that." Kyle sat down on the floor, and after a moment, the 3 children sat facing him. "You want to hear a story the council doesn't want you to know?" 3 sets of eyes widened. Nira's inner eyelids blinked rapidly. "You would do that? Even though it's forbidden?" "Who said anything about forbidden?" Kyle smiled. "I'm going to tell you a story about my people. About Earth. No one's locked that away yet because humanity's history is still being written." He leaned forward. "Want to hear how humans first left their planet?" Prox's crystalline body chimed softly, which Kyle had learned meant yes. "All right then," Kyle began. "Earth is a heavy planet. The gravity is stronger than most worlds in the galactic community. That made it really hard for us to build rockets that could escape into space. Every scientist said it would take enormous amounts of fuel, perfect calculations, and incredible luck. Most people thought it was impossible. But humans did it anyway?" Zix asked eagerly. "Not at first," Kyle said. "We failed, a lot. Rockets exploded on launch pads. Capsules burned up in the atmosphere. People died trying. But here's the thing about humans. We don't accept impossible very well. We're stubborn like that." He told them about Yuri Gagarin and Neil Armstrong, about Sally Ride and Mae Jemison, about the International Space Station and the Mars colonies. He kept his language simple, but he didn't hide the failures or the dangers. He told them the truth. The children listened with complete attention, their eyes wide with wonder. When Kyle finished, Nira asked quietly, "Why didn't humans stop after the failures?" Kyle thought about that. "Because some things are worth trying for, even if you might fail. Because the only true failure is never trying at all." Prox chimed again, a different note this time. Thoughtful. "Will you tell us more stories?" Zix asked. "Please?" Kyle looked at the 3 hopeful faces and made a decision that would change everything. "Meet me in Cargo Bay 7 tomorrow evening. And tell any friends who want to hear real stories." He stood up and walked away, leaving the children whispering excitedly behind him. The sealed doors of the Grand Archive loomed above, keeping their secrets locked away. But Kyle Harper carried a library of his own in his head and heart. Every human did, and no council in the galaxy could seal that away. Cargo Bay 7 smelled like recycled air and metal. Kyle arrived early, carrying a small bag with some of his books from Earth. He'd chosen an unused section of the bay where storage containers created a natural amphitheater of sorts. The lighting was dim, but that somehow made it feel more intimate. Like gathering around a campfire in ancient times. He half expected no one to show up. Maybe the children had been caught. Maybe they'd changed their minds. Maybe he was making a huge mistake. But 10 minutes before the scheduled time, Zix appeared, darting between containers with Nira and Prox close behind. Then came others. 2 more Tarn younglings, scales in different shades. A Kelsh boy who looked older than Nira. 3 Orthani, their crystalline bodies creating a soft light in the darkness. A few species Kyle didn't even recognize yet. Within 15 minutes, 23 children sat in a semicircle around him, their eyes bright with anticipation. "You all came," Kyle said. "Surprised, we told our friends," Zix explained. "Everyone wants to hear human stories. The elders say they're too wild and dangerous for us. That makes them sound really interesting." Kyle laughed despite himself. "Well, I don't know about dangerous, but they're true. Every story I tell you happened to real people on my world." He pulled out his copy of the Odyssey. "This one is almost 3,000 years old. We still read it today. 3,000 years?" Nira's voice rose with disbelief. "Why would you keep reading the same story for so long?" "Because it still means something," Kyle said simply. "Good stories don't get old. They remind us who we are and who we want to be." He'd prepared several tales for tonight. He started with the story of the Voyager probes, those brave little machines humanity had sent beyond the solar system, carrying messages for anyone who might find them. Golden records with images, sounds, music from Earth. A message in a bottle thrown into an ocean of stars. "We didn't know if anyone was out there," Kyle explained. "We had no proof that other intelligent life existed. But we sent those messages anyway, hoping that someday someone would find them and know we had existed, know we had tried to reach out." That's kinda sad, one of the young Tarn said softly. Maybe, Kyle agreed, but it's also hopeful. We were alone in the dark, but we kept calling out, kept reaching, kept hoping. That's very human. The children absorbed this silently. Kyle could see them processing it, comparing it to their own species' stories. The Velkari had known about galactic civilization for nearly 90,000 years. The Tarn for 70,000. They'd never experienced that profound loneliness of thinking you might be the only voices in the universe. Next, Kyle told them about the Apollo missions. He described the moon hanging in Earth's sky, that silvery circle humans had stared at for hundreds of thousands of years. He told them about President Kennedy's challenge, about the scientists and engineers and astronauts who made the impossible real. He told them about Apollo 1 and the 3 men who died in a fire during a test, and how the program nearly ended right there. But it didn't end, Zick said. It wasn't a question. No, Kyle confirmed. It didn't. Because those 3 men believed in reaching the moon, and the people who survived them decided the best way to honor that sacrifice was to finish the job. Apollo 11 landed on the moon 2 years later. Neil Armstrong stepped onto the surface and said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Your species honored failure by trying again?" Prox chimed, confused. That seems illogical. If people died, wouldn't you stop to prevent more deaths? Kyle nodded. You'd think so, and it is a risk. But humans have this idea that some dreams are worth bleeding for, worth dying for even. Not because we don't value life, but because we value meaning. We want our lives to count for something bigger than just existing. He could see this concept was difficult for some of them to grasp. Their civilizations had evolved past such primitive risk-taking. They valued safety and preservation above all else. That was why the Preservation Council existed in the first place. Over the next hour, Kyle shared more stories. The formation of the United Nations. The near-extinction event of 2087 when Earth's climate systems nearly collapsed, and how humanity pulled together to save their world. The first warp drive test that nearly destroyed the entire research station, but eventually opened the galaxy to human exploration. He told them about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, about scientists who worked for decades on problems with no guarantee of success, about artists who created beauty in the midst of suffering, about teachers who shaped young minds knowing they'd never see the full results of their efforts. Between stories, the children asked questions. Lots of questions. Why do humans fight each other if you're all the same species? Nira wanted to know. We're not all the same, Kyle explained. We have different cultures, different beliefs, different ways of seeing the world. Sometimes those differences lead to conflict. We're still learning how to be better at living together. Do humans ever give up? Asked a small Orthani whose name Kyle learned was Chicks. Of course we do, Kyle said honestly. We're not some perfect species. Individuals give up all the time. We get tired, scared, overwhelmed, but there's always someone else willing to pick up where others left off. We fail forward, if that makes sense. Even our failures teach us something. The younglings seem to find this fascinating. Their own species' histories, at least the approved versions they learned in school, were clean narratives of steady progress and logical development. The messy reality of human advancement, full of setbacks and emotions and irrational hope, was completely foreign to them. As the session was ending, Kyle noticed a figure in the shadows near the entrance. His heart jumped, thinking they'd been discovered, but the figure didn't call for security. After a moment, Kyle recognized the shimmer of Velkari chitin. Someone was watching them. He kept his voice steady and finished the story he was telling. When the children finally dispersed, chattering excitedly among themselves, the shadow remained. Kyle approached slowly. How long have you been there? He asked the darkness. A young Velkari female stepped into the light. She wasn't Thresh, but Kyle recognized her from the archives. She worked in the restoration department. Her nameplate identified her as Silith. Long enough to hear about your moon landing, she said quietly. Her mandibles moved in what Kyle had learned was nervousness. I followed the younglings. I thought they might be getting into trouble. Are you going to report us? Silith was silent for a long moment. The story about the 3 astronauts who died in the fire. You said their species honored them by continuing their work. Yes. My people's history contains similar stories, Silith said softly, before we became archivists. Before the council appointed us as keepers of knowledge. We were explorers once. bold and curious. But those stories are in the restricted sections now. Even we cannot access our own unfiltered history. Kyle felt a chill run down his spine. Why? Because the council decided our aggressive phase was better forgotten. They preserved the calm, logical version of Velkari evolution. They sealed away the chaos and passion that made us who we were. Seelith's compound eyes fixed on Kyle. Your stories reminded me that we used to be different, before we became so safe. You're not going to report us, Kyle said, understanding. No. Seelith agreed. I'm not. But others will notice eventually. The younglings talk. They ask questions they never asked before. Someone will trace it back to you. I know, Kyle said. But these kids deserve better than sanitized fairy tales. They deserve the truth. Truth is dangerous, Seelith warned. Kyle smiled. The best things usually are. Seelith turned to leave, then paused. Tomorrow night, will you tell more stories? Planning on it. Then I will listen again, Seelith said. From the shadows where it is safe. But I will listen. After she left, Kyle stood alone in the cargo bay. He thought about seeds planted in darkness waiting to grow. He thought about stories passed down through generations, keeping truth alive when authority tried to bury it. He thought about 23 children who now knew that humans existed in a galaxy that told them to stay quiet and obedient. And he smiled, because he knew that tomorrow there would be more children, and more stories. The library might be sealed, but knowledge found a way. It always did. Humans had learned that lesson a long time ago. Kyle had been telling stories for 3 weeks when the summons came. He was in his quarters preparing for that evening's session. The group had grown to nearly 60 younglings now, and he'd had to move them to a larger cargo bay. He'd started bringing more books from his personal collection, showing the children what actual Earth literature looked like. Paper pages that turned, covers that wore with age, margins where humans had written notes to themselves across centuries. The door chimed with an urgent pattern that made Kyle's stomach drop. He opened it to find 2 security officers, their species unimportant behind their identical armor. Lieutenant Kyle Harper, one said, you are summoned to appear before the Galactic Preservation Council. Immediately. Kyle had known this moment would come. He'd prepared himself for it. But his hands still shook slightly as he followed the officers through the station's corridors. Other beings stepped aside as they passed, watching with curious or concerned expressions. News traveled fast on Nexus Station. The council chamber was enormous, a circular room with a domed ceiling that displayed a perfect recreation of deep space. 12 platforms ringed the room's perimeter, each holding a representative from one of the galaxy's eldest species, the Velkari, the Tarn, the Kelsh, the Orthani, and 8 others whose names Kyle was still learning. At the center platform stood High Curator Venth, a Velkari so ancient that parts of his chitin had turned nearly black with age. His compound eyes fixed on Kyle with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. Lieutenant Harper, Venth's voice resonated through translation devices. You stand accused of violating Protocol 7 of the Cultural Preservation Act, specifically, exposing developing species youth to unregulated ideological content. How do you respond? Kyle took a deep breath. I've been telling children stories about my homeworld. That's not a crime. The content of these stories is the issue, said a Tarn counselor named Vex. Her scales were pale with age, almost white. You speak of war, conflict, failure, and irrational risk-taking. You glorify emotional decision-making over logical analysis. You encourage questioning of established authority structures. I tell the truth, Kyle countered. Human history includes all those things because that's how we developed. Should I lie to them instead? You should tell them nothing, another counselor said, this one from a species Kyle didn't recognize. Its form was gaseous, contained in a transparent suit. Their education is not your responsibility. Their guardians and teachers provide appropriate knowledge frameworks. You undermine those frameworks with your unfiltered narratives. Appropriate knowledge frameworks? Kyle felt his frustration building. You mean the sanitized versions that make every species look like they evolved peacefully, from simple logic to complex logic with no mess in between? Yes, Venth said simply. That is precisely what we mean. The young must understand that civilization requires order, patience, and respect for those who came before. Your species is barely 2 centuries into space travel. You cannot comprehend the damage that premature philosophical exposure can cause. Then explain it to me, Kyle challenged. Show me the evidence that learning about human history is harmful to these kids. The council members exchanged glances. Finally, Vex spoke. 30,000 years ago, a young species called the Kresh gained access to unrestricted archives. They learned about the warrior cultures of elder species. Within 500 years, they had militarized their entire civilization and launched campaigns of conquest that cost billions of lives. It took the combined might of 15 established species to stop them. Kyle absorbed this. That's terrible. But one species making bad choices doesn't mean all younger species need to be treated like children forever. You misunderstand, Venth said. It has happened 17 times in recorded galactic history. 17 distinct instances of younger species being corrupted by inappropriate knowledge. The Preservation Council was formed to prevent a 18th occurrence. So your solution is to lock away anything that might inspire independent thought? Kyle shook his head. That's not protection. That's control. Call it what you wish, Venth replied. It has maintained galactic peace for 82,000 years. The longest period of stability our civilization has ever known. And we will not allow one impetuous human to threaten that stability. The younglings I've been teaching aren't being radicalized, Kyle argued. They're being inspired. There's a difference. They're asking questions and thinking creatively. That's not dangerous. It is dangerous, Vex insisted. Already we have reports from parents. Young Tarn questioning their caste assignments. Kelsh youth proposing alternative governance models. Orthani experimenting with emotional logic matrices. Your stories are disrupting established social orders. Good, Kyle said firmly. Maybe those social orders need some disrupting. The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs and clicks and chimes. Venth raised one clawed appendage for silence. You admit your intention is to destabilize established civilizations? No, Kyle said carefully. My intention is to share knowledge. What people do with that knowledge is their choice. That's called freedom. Freedom is chaos, Venth said coldly. We have seen where it leads. Before Kyle could respond, a voice rang out from the observation deck above. Request permission to address the council. Kyle looked up and felt his heart skip. Silith stood at the railing, her copper chiton gleaming under the chamber lights. Archivist Silith, Venth said with obvious displeasure. This is a closed proceeding. I invoke the right of historical testimony, Silith said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her mandibles. I have evidence relevant to this case. The council members conferred in whispers and clicks. Finally, Venth gestured irritably. Speak quickly. Silith descended to the main floor. Kyle noticed she carried a data tablet. I have been researching the restricted archives, specifically the sealed histories of our own species. With respect, High Curator, our people were not always the cautious archivists we are today. Ancient history, Venth dismissed. Irrelevant. I disagree, Silith said boldly. Several council members gasped at her tone. 47,000 years ago, the Velkari were explorers and adventurers. We took enormous risks. We failed frequently. Our literature from that period is passionate, chaotic, and filled with the same elements the council now calls dangerous. She held up her tablet. I have documented over 3,000 examples. Those records are sealed for good reason, Venth said sharply. They represent our immature phase. They represent who we were before the council decided who we should be, Silith corrected. When did we lose the right to our own complete history? When did truth become something to hide from? You overstep, Archivist. Perhaps, Silith agreed. But Lieutenant Harper's stories made me question why we hide our past. And in questioning, I found that the council has systematically edited or sealed the historical records of every species represented here, not to protect the young, but to maintain a specific narrative of how civilizations should develop. Enough. Venth's voice cracked like thunder. You are relieved of your duties, Archivist Silith. Security will escort you from this chamber. As security officers moved toward Silith, Kyle stepped forward. Wait. If she's in trouble for questioning your authority, then your problem isn't with me. It's with the truth itself. You're afraid that if people, young or old, start thinking for themselves, they won't need you to tell them what to think anymore. We maintain order, Venth said icily. You maintain power, Kyle shot back. There's a difference. The chamber fell silent. The tension was thick enough to cut. Finally, Venth spoke. Lieutenant Harper, you are hereby confined to your quarters pending diplomatic negotiations with Earth's representatives. You are forbidden from accessing any station systems or communicating with any individuals outside official channels. The younglings who attended your sessions will be re-educated in proper cultural frameworks. Archivist Silith is demoted to maintenance duties. He paused. Consider yourselves fortunate that the Council values diplomatic relations over justice. This isn't justice, Kyle said quietly. It's suppression. Call it what you wish, Venth repeated his earlier words. You are dismissed. As security escorted Kyle from the chamber, he caught Silith's eye. She made a small gesture with her claws. A human thumbs up she must have learned from watching him. Despite everything, Kyle smiled. They could confine him. They could demote Silith, but they couldn't unsay the stories. They couldn't unthink the thoughts those stories had planted. The Council had just made a critical mistake. They'd turned this from a quiet rebellion into a public confrontation. And if there was one thing humans knew about, it was fighting for what they believed in, even when the odds looked impossible. Especially when the odds looked impossible. Back in his quarters, Kyle stared out at the nebula. His communication access was blocked, but his books remained. He picked up his worn copy of the Odyssey and opened to a random page. The words stared back at him, ancient and true. Ideas, Kyle thought, were harder to cage than people. They spread like fire, passed from mind to mind, growing stronger with each telling. The Council had just added fuel to that fire. They'd learned soon enough what happened when you tried to suppress human stubbornness. It never ended. Well, for the people doing the suppressing. 3 days into his confinement, Kyle discovered that someone had left a datapad outside his door. He found it during the morning meal delivery, tucked under the tray. The device was old, the kind that wouldn't show up on station security scans. When he powered it on, he found a single message. Your stories matter. We're listening. Keep talking. There was no signature, but Kyle recognized Silith's communication pattern from the careful grammar and formal phrasing. Kyle spent the next hour figuring out the station's communication network. Every system had backdoors if you knew where to look, and he'd spent years working with Earth's military networks. By evening, he'd found a frequency that seemed unused by official channels. He took a breath, opened one of his books, and started recording. This is Kyle Harper, and I want to tell you a story. It's about a woman named Valentina Tereshkova. She was the first human woman to travel to space back in 1963. Some people said women shouldn't be astronauts. They said space was too dangerous, too demanding. Valentina proved them wrong. She spent 3 days orbiting Earth, longer than all the American astronauts combined at that time. He uploaded the recording to the unused frequency and went to bed, unsure if anyone would even find it. The next morning, his datapad chimed with an incoming message. Then another. Then dozens more. We heard your story, wrote someone identifying themselves only as a young listener. Please tell us more, wrote another. My guardian tried to make me stop listening, but I found a way to keep the recording, wrote a third. Kyle's hands shook as he read through the messages. His stories had reached far beyond Cargo Bay 7. Someone, probably several someones, had been distributing his recordings throughout the station, maybe beyond. Over the following days, Kyle recorded everything he could remember. He told stories about Marie Curie and her research into radioactivity, working in a shed with barely any equipment. He told them about Frederick Douglass, who taught himself to read when it was illegal, and used those forbidden words to fight for freedom. He told them about the small team of engineers who saved Apollo 13 when everything went wrong, using nothing but creativity and determination. He told them about ordinary people who did extraordinary things not because they were special, but because they chose to be. The messages multiplied. At first, they came just from Nexus Station, then from other stations in the system. Within 2 weeks, Kyle was receiving responses from across multiple star systems. My daughter asked her teacher why their textbook doesn't include failures, wrote a Kelch parent. The teacher didn't have an answer. I'm 17 cycles old, wrote a young Tarn. I've never questioned my caste assignment until now. Your story about the human civil rights movement made me think. Why do we accept that some of us are born to serve while others are born to lead? I'm a teacher, wrote a Velkari educator. I've been teaching approved curriculum for 40 years. Your stories made me realize I've been teaching students what to think, not how to think. I don't know if I can continue, but not all the messages were supportive. "You are corrupting our youth," wrote an angry parent. "My son now questions everything I tell him. You have destroyed the respect children should have for their elders. The council is right to silence you," wrote another. "Your species is too young to understand the dangers of your own philosophy. You spread chaos disguised as wisdom." The controversy grew. Kyle could feel it through the walls of his quarters, in the tense voices of security officers who delivered his meals, in the way station announcements had become more frequent and more forceful about maintaining cultural integrity. Then the protests started. Kyle couldn't see them, but he heard about them through the messages flooding his datapad. Young beings from dozens of species gathered at the Grand Archive, demanding access to the sealed sections. They held signs with quotes from Kyle's stories. They sang human songs they'd found in unrestricted databases. The council responded by increasing security and threatening parents with legal consequences if they didn't control their children. That only made things worse. The movement spread to other stations, other systems. Someone started calling it the Reader's Rebellion, though Kyle thought that was a bit dramatic. It wasn't a rebellion. It was just kids wanting to learn, and adults wanting to teach them. But the council saw it as an existential threat. On the 14th day of his confinement, Kyle received an unexpected visitor. His door opened to reveal Captain Lisa Monroe, Earth's diplomatic representative to the Galactic Council. She was a stern woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back tight and eyes that missed nothing. "Captain," Kyle said, surprised. "I didn't know you were on the station." "I wasn't," Monroe said, stepping inside. The door closed behind her. "I arrived 6 hours ago for emergency negotiations. Do you have any idea what you've started, Lieutenant?" "I was just telling stories, ma'am. Stories that have sparked protests on 47 different stations. Stories that have created the largest youth movement the galactic community has seen in 70,000 years. Stories that have put Earth's diplomatic status in serious jeopardy." Monroe's expression was hard to read. "The council wants you removed from the station immediately. Some members want you prosecuted under galactic law." Kyle's stomach sank. "I understand, ma'am." "I'm not finished," Monroe continued. She pulled out her own data pad and showed him a screen filled with statistics. "In the 2 weeks since you started broadcasting, applications to Earth's cultural exchange programs have increased by 300%. Requests for English language lessons have gone up by 400%. Human literature downloads have exceeded the total for the previous 10 years combined." She looked up at him. "You've made humanity the most talked about species in the galaxy. For better or worse. I'm sorry, Captain. I didn't mean to cause problems for Earth, didn't you?" Monroe's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Lieutenant, I've read the transcripts of your trial. You stood in front of the most powerful beings in the galaxy and told them they were wrong. That takes either extraordinary courage or extraordinary stupidity." "Probably both, ma'am." This time Monroe did smile briefly. "Probably." She sat down in the chair across from him. "Here's the situation. The council is divided. The conservative faction wants you prosecuted. The moderate faction wants you quietly expelled from the galactic community. But there's a third faction, mostly younger members, who think you might be right." "About what?" "About everything. About the archives, about knowledge restriction, about treating younger species like children. They've been watching what happens when you tell the truth to young beings, and contrary to the council's fears, the galaxy hasn't collapsed. These kids aren't forming armies or starting wars. They're asking questions. Good questions. Hard questions that their parents and teachers are struggling to answer." Monroe leaned forward. "I've been authorized to deliver an ultimatum to the council. If they continue suppressing knowledge and prosecuting humans for sharing their own history, Earth will withdraw from the galactic community entirely. We'll close our borders, recall our diplomats, and go our own way." Kyle felt shock ripple through him. "That would isolate humanity." "Yes," Monroe agreed. "And the council knows it would also inspire other younger species to do the same. The foundation of their power is that everyone accepts their authority. If species start leaving, the whole system breaks down. What happens to me? That depends on the council's decision," Monroe said. "But whatever happens, I want you to know something." She stood up, preparing to leave. "When I was a girl, my grandmother told me stories about Earth. About the struggles, the failures, the triumphs. She told me that humans don't accept being told what we can't do. She said that stubbornness, that refusal to accept limits, is what makes us human." Monroe looked directly at Kyle. "You did that woman proud, Lieutenant. You did all of us proud." After she left, Kyle sat in silence, processing everything. He'd started this wanting to help some curious kids learn about his world. He'd never imagined it would turn into something this big. His datapad chimed with a new message. This one was from Zix, the first young Tarn he'd met at the sealed archive doors. Kyle, we heard about the captain's visit. We heard about the ultimatum. We want you to know that whatever happens, you change things. You changed us. Before your stories, I thought my life was already decided. I was born into the worker caste, so I would die in the worker caste. Now I know that paths can change, that futures aren't fixed. Thank you for teaching us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's trying anyway, just like you did. Kyle read the message 3 times, feeling something tight in his chest loosen. This was why he'd taken the risk. Not for glory or recognition, but for that message. For that one young being who now believed he could choose his own path. He picked up his datapad and started recording another story. This one was about Rosa Parks, a seamstress who changed a nation by refusing to give up her seat on a bus. A quiet act of defiance that sparked a revolution. Sometimes, Kyle thought, the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. With one person deciding that enough is enough, that truth matters more than comfort. He uploaded the recording to the network and waited. Across the galaxy, in darkened rooms and hidden spaces, young beings. The trial was scheduled for the 21st day of Kyle's confinement, and it would be broadcast across the entire galactic network. Every species, every station, every world with communication access would be able to watch. The council had decided to make an example of him. They had no idea what they were walking into. Kyle entered the council chamber wearing his Earth military dress uniform. Captain Monroe had insisted on it. Let them see what they're really dealing with, she'd said. Not some random troublemaker. A representative of humanity. The chamber was packed. The observation decks were filled with beings of every species, and security had to turn away thousands more. Outside the station, ships gathered just to be close to where history was being made. High Curator Venth looked ancient and tired as he called the session to order. We are here to determine the fate of Lieutenant Kyle Harper of Earth, who stands accused of violating the Cultural Preservation Act and inciting civil disobedience among multiple species youth populations. This trial will determine not only his fate, but the future of humanity's participation in the galactic community. The prosecution presented their case first. They showed recordings of the protests, statistics about increased questioning of authority among young beings, testimonies from concerned parents and educators about disrupted social orders. They painted Kyle as a dangerous radical who threatened 80,000 years of peace and stability. Then it was the defense's turn. Captain Monroe stood. The prosecution speaks of disruption. I speak of awakening. They speak of danger. I speak of growth. Lieutenant Harper shared stories about Earth because he was asked. Because young beings tired of sanitized fairy tales wanted to know the truth. And the truth is this. Every species in this chamber went through chaos on their way to stability. Every species made mistakes, fought wars, struggled with questions of identity and purpose. But the council has hidden those stories, locked them away, pretended they never happened. Why? Because truth is messy. Truth is uncomfortable. Truth forces us to think rather than simply obey. She turned to face Venth directly. You say Lieutenant Harper violated your Cultural Preservation Act. I say that act itself violates something far more fundamental. The right of all beings to learn, to question, to grow. Humanity will not apologize for believing in that right. Then came the testimony that changed everything. Zix, Nira, and Prox entered the chamber together. 3 young beings who should have been terrified standing before the most powerful council in the galaxy, but they walked with their heads high. We want to speak, Zix said, his voice clear despite the tremor in it. This is highly irregular, Venth protested. Let them talk, said Counselor Vex. Kyle was surprised to see the elderly Tarn counselors speak in support. They are the ones supposedly harmed by Lieutenant Harper's actions. Let them describe this harm, Zix stepped forward. Before I met Kyle, I thought my life was a straight line. I was born into the worker caste. I would workmate, produce offspring, and die. All according to plan. I never questioned it because I didn't know questioning was allowed. He looked up at the council. Kyle didn't tell me to reject my caste. He told me about humans who changed their circumstances, who refused to accept that birth-determined destiny. Now I'm studying engineering in my free time. I might still be a worker, but I'll be a worker who chose that path. That's the difference, Nira spoke next. My people value harmony above all else. We're taught that disagreement creates chaos. But Kyle told us about human debates, human elections, human protests. He showed us that disagreement can create progress. That harmony without questions is just silence. Her amphibious skin rippled with emotion. I'm not rejecting my culture. I'm enriching it. Prox's crystalline body chimed as they spoke. I am Orthani. We process information through pure logic matrices. Emotions are considered inefficient. But Kyle's stories showed me that emotion and logic aren't opposites. They're complements. Humans use both to reach the stars. Now I'm experimenting with hybrid processing models. My teachers say it's impossible. I say humans prove it's not. One by one, more younglings came forward. Dozens of them, each telling how Kyle's stories had changed their perspective, opened their minds, given them permission to dream bigger than their societies had allowed. Then something unexpected happened. Adults started testifying. Teachers who admitted they'd been teaching memorization instead of critical thinking. Scientists who confessed they'd stopped proposing radical theories because the council preferred incremental progress. Artists who revealed they'd been creating safe, approved works instead of following their inspiration. And finally, Silith stepped forward. She carried a large data crystal that glowed with internal light. Honored Council, I have completed my research into our sealed archives. What I found should concern all of us. She activated the crystal, and holographic documents appeared throughout the chamber. Every species represented on this council has had their history edited. Wars removed, failures hidden, chaotic periods sanitized. The council has systematically created a false narrative of steady, logical progress for every civilization. Those edits were necessary, Venth said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. Were they? Silith challenged. Or were they convenient? Because when I compare our species' actual development to the approved versions, I see something remarkable. Our greatest innovations, our most important cultural developments all occurred during the chaotic periods. The periods you've hidden. She turned to address the entire chamber. We've been taught that chaos is dangerous. But what if chaos is necessary? What if the mess, the failure, the struggle is what makes species strong? The chamber erupted in discussion. Counselors argued among themselves. The observation decks buzzed with conversation. Venth struck his gavel for order. This proves nothing. The creche incident alone justifies our preservation protocols. Does it? Captain Monroe asked. Because I've been researching the creche myself. Yes, they became aggressive after accessing unrestricted archives. But do you know what they accessed? Military tactical databases, weapons development records, conquest strategies from elder species' own wars. They didn't learn creativity or hope or perseverance. They learned violence because violence was what they found. If the archives had been genuinely complete, showing both the wars and the peacemaking, both the conflicts and the reconciliations, might the outcome have been different? Silence fell across the chamber. You want to protect young species, Monroe continued. I understand that. But you can't protect them by hiding the truth. You can only prepare them by teaching them to think, to question, to learn from every part of history, good and bad. That's what Kyle did. He didn't teach those children what to think. He taught them that thinking is allowed. Venth looked older than ever. And if we reject your argument? If we find Lieutenant Harper guilty and demand Earth's compliance with preservation protocols, then Earth leaves the galactic community, Monroe said without hesitation. And we won't be alone. I've received communications from 42 younger species governments. They're waiting to see what happens here today. If you choose suppression over freedom, they'll follow Earth into isolation. Your galactic community will fracture into elder species maintaining order over themselves and younger species building something new. Is that the legacy you want? The council members conferred for nearly an hour. Kyle stood still, watching the most powerful beings in the galaxy struggle with a simple question. Did they believe in freedom or control? Finally, Venth spoke. The council is divided. We cannot reach consensus on prosecution. Therefore, we propose a compromise. He looked directly at Kyle. Lieutenant Harper will face no criminal charges. However, the Cultural Preservation Act will be reformed. The Grand Archive will be unsealed. All species will have access to complete historical records, including their own unedited histories. Content advisories will be provided, but access will not be denied. A murmur of shock ran through the chamber. Furthermore, Venth continued, the Preservation Council will be restructured as an advisory body rather than an authoritative one. Each species will determine their own approach to education and cultural development. We will offer guidance. We will not impose control. He paused, and Kyle saw something in the ancient curator's eyes. Not anger. Not defeat. Maybe understanding. Maybe relief. The galaxy has been stable for 80,000 years, Venth said quietly. But stable does not mean alive. Perhaps it is time we remembered that growth requires risk, that knowledge demands courage. That truth, however chaotic, is the only foundation worth building on. The chamber exploded with sound, some cheering, some protesting, all shocked. Kyle felt Captain Monroe's hand on his shoulder. You did it, she said. You crazy, stubborn human. You actually did it. 3 days later, Kyle stood at the entrance to the Grand Archive. The bars were gone. The seal removed. The doors stood open wide. Beings of all ages lined up to enter. Kyle saw Zix and his family, the young Tarn bouncing with excitement. Nira and her podmates discussing what sections to explore first. Prox, their crystalline body chiming with anticipation. Silith approached, her copper chitin gleaming in the soft light. They've asked me to be the new head archivist, she said. Focused on accessibility rather than preservation.